Mais uma vez, boa tarde. Vamos entrar na reta final deste congresso e com dois momentos altos. Daqui a pouco vamos ter o Estado da Nação das Telecomunicações e já a seguir diria mesmo que é um grande privilégio ter aqui connosco em direto dos Estados Unidos uma jornalista, uma historiadora e a vencedora do prémio Pulitzer. Talvez alguns de vós conheçam os livros dela. Ela escreve sobre várias coisas, mas concretamente sobre comunismo, sobre democracia
communism, democracy, and she tries to explain what is behind the world order, in addition to what we see on the news, what's behind it, and how this can affect us. Her name is Anne Applebaum. She'll be live and is live, and she will be speaking with Pedro Faustino.
Olá, boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon,
I will now switch
everyone.
to English. So please, dear colleagues, join me on welcoming our special guest for this afternoon, Anne Applebaum. Hello, Anne. Good afternoon. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you fine. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you among us in this Congress this afternoon, Anne. Anne Applebaum is an historian, a researcher, a journalist. In fact, Anne, your work is so well known that there is no need for a large introduction. So let me go straight to the first question. Anne, you have been spending many, many years researching on the political global shifts in the world. Recently, it seems that we are witnessing a wave of democratic decline. So my first question, it's a simple but very troubling one, is what is really happening? I mean, are we losing the battle for democracy?
So first of all, it's important to remember that history is not inevitable. There is no historical pattern. Just because things are going in one direction doesn't mean they continue. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we do today. So thinking about inevitability or some kind of end of the games kind of scenario is the wrong way to think about politics. We are living in a moment when changing technology and different kinds of technology, I do think has turned out to be both better for the autocratic world in several ways, and also has made the conduct of democracy more difficult and has facilitated the rise of anti-democratic movements inside a lot of democracies, including some of the most historic ones and stable ones. By technology that enhances autocracy, I mean surveillance technology, not only the kind that monitors where people move on the streets, but the kind that can track them on the internet, can track sentiment, can understand political movements. Of course, the masters of that kind of technology, both in real life and online, and the ways in which they can be connected together are the Chinese. But they have begun to export their system to other countries as well. So the power that is now available to bad actors, to would-be autocrats, to dictators is unlike anything that was available in the 20th century, to monitor people, to track people, to know what they're thinking, to know how they're connected to one another. All these things are now available to dictators. And at the same time, some of that same technology, although in the democratic world it's mostly controlled by private companies, is also being used to divide and polarize populations all across the democratic world. In our societies, the same kinds of online tracking and online surveillance technology are used very often by private companies who use them to sell advertising to people. But it's turned out that selling advertising is easier to do if you can make people angry or upset or divided, or if you can sort them into separate echo chambers. All these phenomena that we now know very well have turned out to be very divisive and bad for any kind of common purpose, any form of public debate. It's very hard now in most democracies, although there are some exceptions, to have anything like a normal public sphere. So a realm of debate where everybody understands the rules and works according to them, where the terms of debate are agreed, and where it's not a matter of, opinions might be different, but facts are shared. That's no longer true in most of the world, and that has enabled also in a number of big democracies the rise of autocrats or would-be autocrats, or people who would use their power to undermine the systems that elected them. And so we see this kind of parallel thing happening in both the autocratic and the democratic world. And right now it favors the big dictatorships, but it also favors would-be autocrats in democracies.
Oh, and let me stick to this point. And thank you for jumping to the elephant on the room. That was my fifth question, but I'll anticipate it, because we are essentially in this room a tech community. And we are, of course, concerned about, we don't want to be the bad guys. Okay. So what advice could you give us as tech leaders? What should we do in our companies to prevent that misuse of technology?
So think about how technology can be used, and think about how it can be used to create links between people, to build consensus, to bring different parts of the political community together. I'm actually aware of a lot of technological projects, people who are working on alternative forms of social media, people who are looking at regulation of existing social media, for example, but not regulation in the sense of creating a big censorship machine that eliminates some language and not others, but regulation that allows more transparency into the system. I actually believe that there would be money to be made by finding ways to connect people and to allow people to communicate that do so according to rules that enhance rather than undermine democracy. And so I think I think there's a lot of space for social media, and perhaps for people who are inventive, who have access to the latest forms of AI, to think about how to use those tools to, as I say, to create consensus and to create better evidence-based and fact-based conversations, rather than just to sell more conspiracy theories and rumors. I've been told many times that it is possible, and I'm really looking to the tech community. I'm looking to people like those in that room to help us find a way forward.
And in your book, Autocracy, Inc., and we have introduced your book here yesterday, you argue that global business elites a bit around the world, even in democratic countries, are complicit in sustaining autocracies. What is driving this alignment between these two?
So if I can give you a little bit of a nuanced answer, I think the period of the 1990s and 2000s, and maybe even into the 2010s, this was an era where many people saw no downside to all kinds of trade with the autocratic world. They just understood that if we make money and they make money, then we'll have more in common. And it's understandable that people believe this. This was the experience of Europe after the Second World War, for example, that links of trade and economics did lead to peace and did actually build democracy on the continent of Europe. But while we weren't paying attention over the last decade, especially Russia and China, but not only, because they have links to other dictatorships, began also to use those ties of trade and economics to build up their armies, to build up their surveillance systems, to find ways to undermine our political systems, to undermine even our trade relationships. And while that was happening, it just took us far too long to see that was going on. So I don't blame people who wanted to do business with the autocratic world when it began to open up in the post-Soviet world and the post-Maoist China, when they began to see that happening. But there was a moment, probably about a decade ago, when we should have stopped. But there's another way in which we also, and I think rather hypocritically, continue to enhance the power of the autocratic world. And that's through allowing the continuing existence of the illicit economy, the shadow economy. I imagine most people sitting in that room, you own your own businesses, you pay taxes in your own name, you probably own property in your own name. When you do business, it's clear, you follow regulations. There's a large part of the world's economy that doesn't operate according to those rules. It operates in the shadows, using shell companies, moving money through offshore tax havens, doing so in a way that's designed to hide money from tax authorities to avoid regulation. And some of that money of course, comes from the autocratic world. It's stolen from the autocratic world. It's then hidden around the planet. Some of it is then used for nefarious purposes. In the United States, it sometimes appears what we call dark money in political campaigns. And it creates the impression as well as the reality of hypocrisy. On the one hand, the democratic world, Europe and America, preach the values of democracy and openness and transparency and the rule of law. And at the same time, we have facilitated the growth and expansion of this illicit world that exists alongside our own. And this is, of course, a world that it exists legally. Shell companies are legal. Anonymously owned property is legal. And we could end it. We could come together. We could decide as a group of free nations that we want to fight kleptocracy, that we want to make our economies work better and be fairer, and we could put an end to that system. We haven't done it yet. I was hoping that the United States would turn out to be the leader in this shift. The Biden administration began working in that direction, but obviously the Trump administration has made a very different choice and is pushing in the other direction towards less transparency, towards less accountability, and towards more corruption. And that, I think, leaves, it's really a big moment for Europe and for Europeans to decide what kind of economic and political future they want for themselves and for their children. Do we as Europeans, do we want to live in a world that where taxes are paid and regulations are real and election campaigns are what they appear to be and not manipulated in ways that we can't see? Or are we going to allow our standards to slip? This is a big turning point when we're coming very close to it right now.
And let's shift gears now, if you read, to the US. We are very comfortable staying here in Europe, but very concerned, as you know, about what's happening in the US. I know you have been close to this topic. And what kind of regime is the US becoming?
So first of all, the good news is that the United States is still a democracy. We have opposition parties. We have freedom of speech. We have, the rules of the Constitution have not changed. But what you're watching in the United States is something that we've seen in other countries at other times and places. We saw a version of it in Hungary over the last decade. We saw it in Turkey. We saw it in Venezuela. We've seen it in history as well. What you are watching is a would-be autocrat or a would-be autocratic political party seek to change the rules in order to give itself more power. The Trump administration is doing this through a variety of tools and mechanisms, some of which I'm sure you've observed. One of them is to push the law very hard, to break the law even, and then wait for the courts to catch up. So the abolition of various government departments that were funded by Congress, the firing of civil servants, that replacing them with loyalists, all of this is illegal. But it's taking time for the courts to match the speed of the executive orders. The use of the military and of a militarized form of customs and border control to sweep up people in the street, also illegal, also unconstitutional. But it's happening, as I say, at speed and at a rate in order both to accrue more power to the president, to create a kind of fear, not just among immigrants, but among other Americans, and also to put on a kind of performance for the president's followers. Which is unfortunately another autocratic tactic, create a kind of spectacle of violence. It's not real violence or not always real violence, but it creates a kind of spectacle that makes people anxious and afraid, but also attracts his own followers. So we see, but again, this is the odd thing for me. I've been studying how these things work for a long time in a lot of different countries, and none of it is very new. We've seen these tactics before. They aren't undefeatable. They aren't, it doesn't mean that the president will win or that he'll change the nature of the U.S. Constitution or the nature of the American polity. But it does mean that his opponents inside his party, as well as in the Democratic Party, need to begin thinking differently. One of the things you're seeing now in the U.S. is also something you saw in Hungary and Turkey and Venezuela, which is a kind of splintering of the opposition as people who are used to having a debate about policy. Do we want higher taxes? Do we want lower taxes? Do we want more welfare state, less welfare state? Are understanding that instead politics has shifted to be about something else. What's legal, what's illegal? What is the nature of our system? Who has rights in it and who doesn't? And making that adjustment, understanding that the nature of politics has changed. Politics is less about policy and it's more about which identity do you choose, which system do you want to be part of. That takes some time for people to catch up. I think most people who were involved in politics over the last several decades were in it because they believed in a certain set of political ideas, a certain set of policies they wanted passed, a vision of healthcare or of infrastructure or of education or of defense or of security. And now they're finding that what they need to fight about instead is something much more fundamental and essential. And getting used to that shift is very difficult. So what you're watching in the United States is a kind of transition in politics, one that we've seen it in other countries. I suppose the surprise is that it's happening in the US, really depending on how you measure and how you define democracy, either the oldest or one of the world's oldest democracies. And of course, because it's the US, it has so many more, such a wider impact and so many more repercussions, because what happens in the US will be imitated in other places. I would expect most democracies to have at least a faction of people who imitate and want to try to do what President Trump is doing inside their own countries. We see plenty of examples already of Trump's language being repeated and used in other contexts. One of the oddest things in my life is, as you might know, I lived part of the time in Poland, which is where I am now. The idea that Poland and the United States, really two countries that couldn't be more different demographically and politically and historically and religiously and every other way, now have quite a lot in common in terms of the Polish political rhetoric that's used. I mean, I think it's very strange, but I think it's not an accident. I mean, it's partly a product of what I began with, that everybody is experiencing the same impact of new technology and social media on their political sphere. But it's also the result of copying and imitation. The far right or the far left in one country will imitate the tactics of another, and that I would expect to see all across Europe over the next few years, even though even in places where it hasn't necessarily started yet.
Despite the warning signs, we cannot say that autocracies are losing popularity. I mean, if you had to have another election in the US, I guess the result would not be much different from this one. So this leads to my reflection and my next question on how are we failing as educators, as leaders, as politicians? How are we failing in defending democracy?
Well, first of all, let me say that quite a lot of autocrats are unpopular, and I am not sure what would happen if you had an election in the U.S., especially after the passage of President Trump's big budget legislation, which is going to be quite damaging for many people. So leave that as a kind of parentheses. Many, if not most dictatorships are unpopular, and many, if not most dictators and autocrats make their countries poorer. Hungary, which was once the star of Central Europe, is now either the poorest or the second poorest country in the EU, depending on how you count. And that's a direct result of the growth of corruption and the growth of favoritism and the growth of autocracy in Hungary. failing as educators, it's true that I can't speak for Portugal. It's true that in quite a few countries, in quite a few democracies, and the United States is certainly one of them, there was over the last 3 or 4 decades a kind of deterioration of teaching of civic values and civic education. There has been a long period in which we took democracy for granted because we won the Cold War, because it seemed to be spreading everywhere so quickly, because it didn't feel like there were many challengers. People began to treat democracy as something automatic and inevitable, the word you used at the beginning, that we use, the idea that it was like water coming out of a tap, it just emerges. You don't have to think where the water comes from. It's just always there. And I think teaching people that it's not always there, it can end. It has ended in the past. Reminding people of the importance of civic engagement, why it's important to understand what's going on in your community, in your local elections, not just in national elections or in international politics. Understanding why it's important for you to exercise your rights and your obligations as a citizen. Why half your job might be at a tech company or an AI firm, but also part of your obligation to your community is being involved. It doesn't have to be politics in the strictest or most partisan sense, but in joint projects, in charitable efforts, in group efforts. It's these associations and organizations that underlie democracy that keep it healthy. And I think a lot of that was forgotten over the last 30 years in the rush towards globalization. And as I said, in this mistaken belief that democracy is inevitable. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Coming back to Europe, do you think this new geopolitical landscape could be an opportunity for Europe?
I think this is an enormous opportunity for Europe, and it's an opportunity in many fields. Certainly, it's an opportunity in technology. Finally, we may have gotten to the moment where Europeans have realized that simply passively accepting American technological leadership is dangerous. You risk losing your cutting edge. You risk control over your political conversations. You may even risk your security. Europeans need to invest in their own security technology, their own communications technology. They need to have their own sources of research, their own science, and I think realizing this at this moment, I think is very healthy. It may be a moment to attract U.S. scientists, U.S. investments, and U.S. entrepreneurs to Europe as well. If the United States is going to go through a period of instability, and I think looks like that's already begun, then it's Europe that emerges as the island of stability, of transparency, and of the rule of law, all the things that make investment predictable and business predictable and easier to conduct. And I think this is another good moment for Europe to take advantage of that, both the perception of it, where Europe is perceived as a kind of island of stability, where regulations are enforced and are predictable and understandable, as opposed to madness in the United States. And this is a moment when Europe can capitalize on that opportunity. In small ways and big ways, in attracting American scientists, in appealing to U.S. companies. Maybe European governments can use this moment to invest in cutting-edge research in a way that hasn't done before. I would love it if the European Union would find ways to work together to create bigger investment funds. I'm not an expert in capital markets unions, but I understand that having bigger European funds and bigger ways for Europeans to attract investment is important as well. And really seeing this moment as one in which Europe can begin to have both not just be a kind of consumer of technology and a consumer of U.S. power, but a producer of technology and power, and to be able to project that outward. I think it's a great moment for that.
And unfortunately, we are rushing to the end of our interview, but I have one final question I would not like to leave without asking you. After everything you have seen, you have covered the the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and we have assisting all these shifts, do we have good reasons to have hope?
We always have good reasons to have hope. Now, look, I mean, for people like the ones who are gathered in this room, pessimism is irresponsible. I mean, you are people with education, with advantages, with talent. You are the people who, if you begin to plan now, you can make the future different. A lot of my optimism in my life comes from having seen people in much worse circumstances. People who, I have friends who've been in the Russian opposition, who were part of the Hong Kong opposition, people who've lived through dictatorships in Venezuela and Africa. And I see people like that, and I see that they continue to work to make their countries better, and they continue to plan and to dream and to think of how the world can be different. I mean, if people in the autocratic world and in really difficult situations can be optimistic or can have, can try to make a different future, then of course people who live in Portugal, in Europe, in the democratic world, of course we have possibilities and optimism. It's all a question of how we plan, how we think about what we want to have next. I mean, it's very important to analyze the situation accurately. That's why I don't believe in, pretending things are better than they are, or in, sugarcoating reality. Analyze how things really are, and then begin to look for alternatives. How can we make sure that we go down a better path and not a worse one tomorrow?
So, despite all this, you are an optimistic.
I am a professionally dedicated optimist.
We had a prime minister like you.
Like you.
Can you share with us some examples of countries that have successfully pushed back on autocracy and recovered for a democratic regime? Are there good examples?
We had an example in the 1990s. So we had a whole half of Europe. Once it left the dominance of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet Empire, chose democracy. Countries as varied as Poland and Romania and the Baltic states built democracies. They did it. It's true they did it with the help of the European Union and encouragement of the European Union and of NATO. And that's actually an example to remember. The importance of those institutions, not just for we think of them as regulators or as annoying or as problems, but they actually were builders of democracy and builders of institutions. And that's, of course, the best example in our lifetimes. More recently, we have seen, we had the election of Joe Biden in 2020 was proof that, nothing is inevitable. The election of Donald Tusk in Poland was proof that even a country that felt at that moment like it was going to be dominated and by another term of an autocratic populist government turned it around. I mean, there are multiple examples throughout history. So it's not it's never impossible.
Thank you for the inspiration, Anne. Unfortunately, we have to close. Not before saying, and that is really rewarding to see how your work has been a beacon to critical thinking and moral clarity in troubled times. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to have you here among us. We look forward to have you in Lisbon next October. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to meeting you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.